Who I am, like where I've been or what I used to be, is not important. Enough to know I've never been anywhere and returned empty-handed. I've made calls, and those calls have been returned, if you know what I mean. I have files people would die for. Maybe some have already. I'm a devotee of dishonorable data. I detect disgrace. I log lies. I bank bad behavior. And I scrutinize scandal. Then and now.
The main thing about Windfall was that there was a woman at the center of it. And not just a woman executive, but a woman who'd gone out with a pickaxe and split rocks in the great outdoors.
She did wrong. She paid the price. The fact is, Viola McMillan went to the big house.
The Toronto Stock Exchange was a pool of gasoline waiting for a match. Windfall was the match, but the victim was Viola.
Imagine if you had $1 million dangled in front of you, and all you had to do was keep your mouth shut for one day. What would you do?
The biggest mining fraud in the history of this planet was pulled off by a Canadian company in 1995. When Bre-X claimed to have found the world's largest gold deposit in Busang, Indonesia, the company shot from being worth pin money to $6 billion. But geologists' core samples had been faked. There was no gold at this remote South Pacific site. Bre-X collapsed and devastated thousands of everyday investors. But how does any company con a $6 billion hoax? Well, take a look at the Windfall Oils and Mines scam of 1964. In July of '64, a car crept down a deserted country road in northern Ontario. In its trunk were cylindrical pieces of rock geologists and miners call core samples. Mining speculators and stock market mavens around the world would have given anything to know if these samples were rich in ore. They wouldn't find out until 3 weeks and millions of dollars later.
Bre-X is essentially Windfall with many, many zeros added onto it. It is a remarkably similar story. At some point, the principals in both companies knew that they were lying, that they had information that would destroy their companies, that there was no gold, there was no copper, there were no minerals. They were both based on the same thing. They were both based on an unspoken lie.
In the investment business, unspoken lies grow up to be stock market scams. And every potential stock fraud needs a specialized and loosely regulated market where it can blossom. The relaxed Toronto Stock Exchange of the 60s was focused on men and mining and ripe for picking.
Well, they're very individualistic. I mean, some stock markets are known for certain sectors. For example, NASDAQ in New York is known as a high-tech market. Toronto has been known for mining and for industry. Alberta is known for oil and gas and junior mining ventures. So it's a matter of degree. How much are you willing to gamble? What are the odds that you're looking for? It's like playing roulette.
Sometimes the roulette wheel is rigged. In 1964, one of the main stock market insiders was a woman playing what was, at the time, a man's game. Viola McMillan began life in 1903 as the 13th of 15 farm children. But by 1964, she was one of the most powerful women in the mining world. Still, Viola wanted more. She wanted to play with an American giant and win. Listening to the radio on April 16th, Viola saw her chance.
This is the National News Bulletin read by John O'Leary. First, the main items. A mining discovery in northern Ontario causes jubilation in the town of Timmins and record-breaking activity on the Toronto Stock Exchange.
The American giant, Texas Gulf, had been working the Timmins area for years. But it wasn't until April '64 that they announced core sample drilling results that estimated over 25 million tons of ore, rich in copper, zinc, and silver. The rush was on.
The trend has been that when we find there is a major discovery somewhere, that a whole bunch of mining companies rush up to the same area to stake ground, and their shares, because of their proximity to this huge find, are going to benefit only because they're in the area. Some of them may be 50 miles away, but people don't stop to think about that. They say, well, we're in that area somewhere, and it just sounds good.
That's a game that's gone on in mining exploration for years, and there's a joke about that. Sometimes if you're not really close to where the discovery is, you say, well, we're just 5 minutes away. And the response to that is, yeah, 5 minutes by phone.
The epicenter of the frenzy was the small mining community of Timmins in northern Ontario, a town clinging to both economic survival and the hard rock surface of the Canadian Shield.
The whole financial community of North America was focused on Timmins because of Texas Gulf, because it was a giant American company, because their find was so spectacular that it attracted world interest. By the end of that first week, by April 20th, you couldn't get an hotel room within 40 miles of Timmins. You couldn't rent a helicopter. You couldn't buy a pair of snowshoes. There was still snow on the ground because in April we still have snow. And for 18 months, we were the exploration capital of the world.
And for that 18 months, the international headquarters of the boom was the Fountain Court Bar of the Empire Hotel, a magnet for prospectors, miners, developers, and draft beer drinkers who sought information and rumor, and who usually knew the difference. One player was noticeable by her absence. As it turned out, she was to be the essential ingredient in the developing stock market disaster. That person was the head of the Canadian Prospectors and Developers Association, Viola McMillan. In 1964, at the time of the Texas Gulf discovery, Viola was managing her multi-million-dollar mining business from a pink-painted penthouse far above Toronto's financial Bay Street Strip. But Viola had made most of her money near Timmins, and she didn't want to be left out of one of the biggest finds in history. So she headed 500 miles north to the swamp and rock landscape she knew so well.
Old-time residents of Timmins are smiling as the town dons a robe reminiscent of the gold rush days of the early 1900s. The young men are already out in the bushland 10 miles north of the town, and prospectors, land speculators, and miners are flocking in, hoping to climb aboard the bandwagon following yesterday's announcement of a 25-million-ton ore discovery near the Northern Ontario community.
The most important single factor in the windfall scam of '64 was a mistake. A big mistake. A very big mistake. In Canada, claims are squares of roughly 40 acres, and staking requires posts at each corner of the land you're claiming. In the last week of February 1964, a Texas Gulf geologist using a small aerial photograph for guidance claimed an area on the northern edge of the company's big find. There was just one problem. The geologist held the photo upside down, and the stakes were driven in the wrong locations. 2 months later, in April, prospector Donald McKinnon was walking across the northern boundary of the Texas Gulf land when he noticed the claims were not staked. The next morning, with his buddies John Larsh and Fred Rousseau, he staked the land properly. Texas Gulf officials phoned the government mining recorder office to correct the mistake, but it was too late. McKinnon, Rousseau, and a man who would become legendary in prospecting circles, John Larsh, had scooped up what they, and Texas Gulf, believed was worth millions.
We ended up with 100% title to it. This was known throughout the mining fraternity at the time, that one of the properties that we had was a property that no doubt had a good geophysical target, good geology, in a close proximity of the Texas Gulf discovery, and quite possibly we could have something commercial.
Claims in hand, the three prospectors set up shop in the Empire Hotel. Meanwhile, Viola was closing in on Timmins. Parking her car on Algonquin Boulevard, she entered the hotel looking for John Larsh.
After talking with Viola, she wanted the best, the very, very best. When we explained what we knew about this particular property, she became very, very enthused, and she said, all right, I must have it.
Late at night, in room 358 of the Empire, Viola McMillan borrowed John Larsh's telephone to call a local lawyer. On an arborite table with a fake wood grain finish, Viola signed a deal to buy what would become the Windfall Mines Company site. She paid $250,000 in Windfall shares and $100,000 in cash, well over $1 million in today's money. Place your bets. The game was on. Viola and her husband George hired the local Bradley brothers to drill core samples and determine if there were valuable ore deposits deep beneath the stony skin of the site they now owned. The Bradley brothers were famous. If there was ore on the site, they'd find it.
What are the possibilities of finding another in the Timmins area?
Well, of course, and I think there'll be at least 4 or 5 new from the result of this one. Everybody's going to go back now and look at everything. They'll be examining everything.
Before you can test or assay core samples, you have to dig them. Diamond bits drill deep into the rock, extracting cylindrical samples which are then tested for minerals. The results tell you if you're a miner or the owner of cottage property. And rule number 1 in the business is that once you know the results, you disclose them. Failure to let the investing public know what you know constitutes fraud. George McMillan stayed at the site, staring at the drills that bit below the granite. Viola headed back to Toronto to tell stories about their new venture.
The storytellers, and storytelling is essential to the industry, for the success of the industry. In a perverse way, you need shady promoters out there drumming up interest. And it's a cynical view, maybe, that we require promoters to tell tall tales. But that's how investment is established. And investment is everything in the mining game, because without money you cannot go out to explore.
Windfall had been snatched from Texas Gulf. The McMillans had a good track record. Telegrams flew. Insiders were talking a sure thing.
At that time, you have to remember, there was a lot of people who knew how to manipulate the stock market. They were sending fake telegrams. They were issuing fake press releases. They would get on the phone and phone a lot of people in the mining business and give them fake results.
By July 1st, the rumor mill was in full swing. Vacant storefronts in Timmins became 24-hour-a-day brokerage houses and quickly filled with dreams. You had to fight your way in, fight to buy shares, and fight your way back out. In the first week, Windfall doubled its value to $1.
It's a gamble, like a game of cards, win, lose, or draw.
Well, how much is gamble and how much is knowledge?
Well, quite a bit of knowledge if you're in with the right people.
I'll tell you how a rumor will work. Let's say you're a large mining company like Noranda, Falconbridge, Cominco, and you have a large exploration department with 25 to 50 people working in it. And I know one person there. So I phone him and I say, I just heard that Windfall pulled 8% copper over 20 feet. Now, he works with 50 people. He's in the mining business. So he says, I just got a phone call saying 8% copper over 20 feet. Now, this rumor goes to his wife, it goes to his daughter, it goes to his stockbroker when he phones up to check on his stocks, and he mentions, by the way, I just heard, and he knows that his stockbroker is always looking for news. So the rumor is spread. So one guy with a telephone making 10 phone calls can have several thousand people spreading a lie.
Does your husband know you're down here?
Oh, yes.
He approves of this.
Yes.
You're not,
he sent me to buy one.
you're not
But
playing
it's too
around.
high already.
You're not playing around with the household money.
Oh, no.
On July 6th, the first core results came in. Later, speculators found out the core samples were full of worthless graphite. There was enough graphite in Timmins to pack all the pencils of the world for 100 years. The bad news was covered up, and the worthless core samples went missing.
To what extent does luck play in making a discovery of this sort?
A very big part. I believe in luck.
Violet Rita Huggard didn't start out lucky. She was born to a poor, rock-bound Muskoka farm family. By the age of 16, the smart, some said sassy girl, found secretarial work in Windsor, Ontario, the Canadian side of the bustling border crossing of Detroit, Michigan. But if anybody thought Violet was going to be happy typing, they were seriously mistaken. Maybe she changed her name from Violet to Viola to avoid any allusion to shrinking.
She was confident, self-assured. She knew what she wanted. She was somewhat close to being blunt.
In Windsor, Viola Huggard met, fell in love with, and married gentle but rugged railroad clerk George McMillan. Where Viola was short, George was lanky. Where Viola was cheeky, George was retiring. Despite their differences, they were both a couple and a team, led in public and in private by Viola.
You have to remember that Viola did all the talking. George had more experience than she did and was well respected in his own right. But when those two were together, she did the talking and he smoked his pipe.
Good evening, Mr. McMillan.
Good evening, Mr. McNully.
Kelly.
I've been hearing some wonderful stories, but something Mrs. McMillan hasn't told me is how both of you got into the prospecting business, Mr. McMillan.
Well, that's a very good question. A number of years in the early 20s, we were both living and working in Windsor, and my uncle had some mining claims in northern Ontario, and one day he said to me, "You better go up and do the assessment work on those claims." I said to Viola, "You better come along with me."
The first time we went up, I took a big suitcase of clothes back about 4 miles into the bush and had to carry them all out again.
Meeting the animals?
Oh, yes. There had been a bear in the cabin while George was out to get me off the train, and I just wouldn't stay in the cabin that night. I grabbed the axe and we started down the trail and stayed with some other prospectors for the night.
Viola was hooked on prospecting, on digging for dormant dollars. During the worldwide Great Depression, she and George lived in heavy canvas tents and slept on cold rock, on a hunt for veins of buried treasure that became her life's blood. Despite the odds, the couple hit pay dirt in 1936, just east of Timmins. Land they held title to was bought by mining giant Noranda and became the fabulously wealthy Halnor Mines. Over its lifetime, Halnor provided $54 million in dividends, and a portion of that went to the McMillans. Now, the childless couple finally tasted the good life. With the vengeance of the self-made nouveau riche, they bought a farm, a penthouse in Toronto, pink Cadillacs, a private plane, and real fur coats. 30-something Viola was lauded by magazines, in the politically incorrect parlance of the time, as a spunky millionaires. But despite their wealth and propensity for fine dining, the couple had become chronic grub stakers, and still spent more time staking claims than flaming steaks.
I asked a friend of mine about Viola McMillan one time, a man who was in her age group. And he said she was hard. She was tough. She was tougher than any man.
By the end of World War II, Viola became president of the Prospectors and Developers Association, the PDA. She took over a motley group of less than 100 prospectors, and 20 years later, still president, she represented over 2,000 active members, perhaps the strongest association of its kind in the world.
Toronto was a very WASP society and a very conventional city. And Viola McMillan stood out like a beacon. Here was this woman, this tiny little woman, bossing around a whole mining organization. It was really quite remarkable.
There's no question that George and Viola McMillan had a reputation. It was a reputation that had been gained over several years in the mining business, and people who watched what went on in mining exploration perhaps would look upon the McMillans as top-drawer people.
If the McMillans were behind Windfall, Windfall had to be a winner. By the end of the first week of July, Windfall stock started to move upwards. Both seasoned market players and blatant newcomers bought and kept on buying. In just 2 weeks, the junior penny stock quadrupled to $2. Rumor and speculation are guaranteed to promote sales, but strangely enough, silence also sells shares. No news is good news.
But this silence was building and building suspense, and the longer it took, the more people said, there is something there.
When George McMillan did not release the results of the first core sample tests, the market didn't even blink. Instead, the $2 shares skyrocketed to $4 each. After all, even Texas Gulf had delayed its initial core sample announcement for months. And look at what they were pulling out of the ground. The Windfall shares soared to $4.70, 8 times their value just 3 short weeks before. In Timmins, George smoked his pipe and drilled deeper. But in Toronto, Viola was oddly quiet.
It really was assumed that if there was any bad news, they'd let us know. Obviously, they're continuing to drill, so this has got to be pretty good stuff. They wouldn't be drilling further if it wasn't okay. The reason why I decided I was going to buy some stock in Windfall was for the sole purpose of making money, and this was where the action was. The momentum was in Windfall. It was down on post 3 on the old trading floor of the stock exchange. I can see it now as I close my eyes. Around the corner, a huge crowd of people. I mean, there's nothing more exciting than to find a stock that all of a sudden starts out in pennies and moves up into the dollar range. And it just sort of keeps going. And the orders just keep flowing in from every corner of the trading floor through all kinds of brokerage houses. And you want to go where the action is. And the action was in Windfall. So I wanted to be a part of it.
2 events now transpired that supported the soaring speculation. First, the Bradley brothers bought Windfall shares. If the guys doing the drilling were buying, there had to be something there. Second, Texas Gulf moved the drill rig onto the land adjoining the Windfall site. In response, over 300,000 Windfall shares were traded in just a few hours. These were paper orders. There were no computers yet. The exchange went mad. The floor was a mess. By the 3:30 p.m. close, Windfall was setting new records for action, share volume, and sales.
To give you an idea of what happened on the stock market prior to Timmins coming along, the Toronto Stock Exchange had had days when the volume was less than 1 million shares. And 4 or 5 million shares was a very big day. When Timmins came along, the volume went up to 25 million shares.
Throughout the purchasing panic, George remained in the bush. In Toronto, chatty Viola stayed suspiciously silent.
She played the timing beautifully. You know, from the time that the core samples were taken from the site in the back of her husband's car, the rumor mill started right away, and she knew how to play those rumors, and she knew the right people to talk to, and she knew what to say and what not to say.
The stock market and security exchange bureaucrats were getting antsy. They called the McMillans in Timmins and Toronto. The Windfall executives cabled back. No results to report. Windfall still drilling.
As I recall now, the Toronto Stock Exchange had demanded some information from the McMillans as to what the heck is going on in this piece of property you've got up there in northern Ontario, because we've heard nothing. Disclose some information.
I was phoning them nearly every day. Whether they were in Toronto or they were in Timmins, I would probably speak to them every day or every second day. And I got the same thing as everybody else, that they didn't have the assay results, and until then, they had nothing to say about the drilling.
The rumor mills ground gossip like grist. On July 27th, a series of mysterious telegrams arrived on the desks of stock exchange members and newspaper editors. They praised the potential of Windfall. They were sent from New York. They were signed by George McMillan. But George was not in New York. He was still in Timmins. 3 days earlier, George had taken 27 core samples to an assay laboratory with the unlikely name of Swastika. Despite the pressure from investors and the exchange, he seemed to be in no hurry for results. He asked the lab to send the reports by regular mail. Viola seemed in no rush either.
Here's a senior mining lady who's got a proposed mine that is in the process of discovery, and she doesn't want to know? I mean, I can't imagine such a thing. It would seem to me that'd be I'd be standing around the assayer's office, waiting with bated breath to find out what the heck was going on.
Finally, on the morning of July 30th, 1 month after the Bradley brothers bit into the black boulders near Timmins, the second assay results were opened in the Windfall offices in Toronto. The information was kept secret from the public until the market closed. Investors, grand and small, held their breath. Some checked their pulse. Some counted their chickens.
I remember the afternoon before the results came out, and I was walking down Bay Street, right out here, and I was going down to the Radio Artists Club, and that's where was about the only place on the street to get a drink, and that's where all the brokers would go after work. And I was walking down the east side of Bay Street, and out from the stock exchange here comes Mance Ketchen, who's the vice president. And I knew him very well, and he had a big smile on his face. And I said, Mance, have you got the Windfall results? Because they said that they were going to be released that day. And he said to me, Pat, I've got them right here in my pocket. And he patted his breast pocket, and he said, I'm going to read them on the way home in the taxi. And I could just imagine what happened to the smile on his face when he opened the envelope and found out the assays were zilch.
The Windfall bubble had burst. Thousands had lost their life savings. People were enraged, and someone had to pay.
When people make and lose money in particular, then we all have a natural human tendency to become sanctimonious and say and start pointing the finger at somebody who is to blame for this.
The analysts were saying this could be a $10 to $20 stock in the case of Windfall. But Viola was selling at $4, hundreds of thousands of shares, and she ended up making millions off it. If people had asked Viola what she was doing, I can bet that she would have said that she's accumulating. So the fact that she was selling, I think, indicates pretty strongly that it was a bogus promotion.
And then when you hear the stories that came in later times, of course, now you know that there should have been flags raised. I mean, a lot of drill cores were removed from the property, one way or another. Oftentimes carried out to the car or the station wagon that was sitting out on a makeshift road not too far from the property. Those drill cores sometimes went to the assayer. Then we find out, of course, that sometimes the drill cores went for a long, long ride in the trunk of a car.
The Toronto Stock Exchange talked about Windfall, but they knew that there were things going on out there that shouldn't be allowed to go on. And rather than have 100 policemen working 24 hours a day for 5 years to unravel all the dirty tricks that took place with all these companies, they said, we have someone in our sights. It's like a hunter. You got 3 or 4 targets, but you kill the one that's in your sights. Viola was in their sights.
Trusting investors had been bilked of millions of dollars. All eyes focused first on the Toronto Stock Exchange. Before anyone got too close, a scapegoat had to be found. Fast. Viola was not even a principal of Windfall. George was the president. George's name was on the phony telegrams praising the mine's potential, and it was George that handled the mysterious missing core samples. But it was Viola who had the high profile in what was still a man's world. Viola was disposable.
People in business look for certain qualities in anyone that's going to take over in an executive position, and the qualities are people have got to be firm, and they've got to be decisive, and they've got to be a bit of a gambler, and they've got to be able to talk well. And when men look at a man with those qualities, they're all admirable. And they look at a woman with those qualities, suddenly she becomes a bitch, too mouthy. And if she's decisive, she's stubborn. And these all become negative qualities because they're not the stereotypical idea of what a woman should be. People thought, well, she had it coming to her. She got out of line.
I think you'd have to really know the temper of the times to make that kind of judgment. Whether she was persecuted and prosecuted because she was a woman, I think is irrelevant to some degree. I think that it's clear that she played a significant role in the Windfall promotion, and therefore it was legitimate that she was taken to task for it.
Well, I don't think in the whole thing anyone had any criminal intent. Like, I don't think Viola said, let's run the stock to $5 so I can sell a whole bunch and get rich and move to Florida. I don't think she did that. And I don't think it was her intent for it to end up this way. And without intent, I don't think there's any criminal activity.
George McMillan is not a dumb miner. George McMillan was a smart miner. A smart miner, visual assays oftentimes will tell you whether it's worthwhile or whether it isn't. George McMillan knew there was nothing in those cores, and he still went on and drilled some more, because the more that they could continue on this fever of the market, the better opportunity they had to sell most of their shares into the market and make a fair amount of money themselves.
The Attorney General of Ontario has authorized an investigation into Windfall Oils and Mines Limited, a company which has been the subject of wild speculation on the Toronto Stock Exchange in recent weeks.
Under the seeping stain of suspicion, Viola McMillan resigned as head of the Prospectors and Developers Association, the group she had nurtured into a political force for 21 years. Called before an investigative government royal commission, Viola was, as ever, the spokesperson. She blamed the uncontrollable nature of the markets for the furious increase in Windfall share values. But the commission didn't buy her story. They condemned the Toronto Stock Exchange as a private, members-only gaming club. John Campbell, director of the Securities Exchange Commission, was forced to resign for personally investing in Windfall Mines, and the exchange was accused of something called institutional arrogance, and forced to admit that Windfall was only one example of common but illegal practices. Even the press was taken to task for regularly reporting rumor as fact.
The media is an unwitting accomplice in these kind of promotions. I don't think that anyone in the press has gone out intentionally and promoted something that they knew was bogus. But they're chasing stories, they're competing with other reporters, other newspapers, so it's important to get that story out first. And so you often see promotions past unfiltered, unscrutinized, running in the media, in the press.
The real story was now out, but it wasn't crystal clear what Viola had actually done. Core samples had been destroyed, but the law didn't require disclosure of results until drilling was completed. The worst transgression seemed to be that the second lab results were illegally withheld until after the stock market had closed for the day. While everyone had been madly buying, Viola had used 53 accounts and 6 brokers to sell, walking away with $1.4 million. That's over $15 million by today's standards. The McMillans and the brokers had made a ton of cash. The little guy was the loser, big time.
At that time, it was the biggest single loss I'd ever taken on the market. Oh, I can't remember exactly, but I probably lost $50,000 that morning. And don't forget, this is 1960, and $50,000 is a lot of money.
Viola and George were arrested, formally charged with fraud, and sent home on bail to await a trial that would probably sentence them to prison. They were caught playing a complicated stock market game.
It's not a game. It turned out, in many cases, when you look at it, you might say it was a game. Who was playing the game? I think that the McMillans were playing a game. I think that they did indeed play a game by withholding information. Withholding information which, if they had released it, would have had a very significant effect upon future market action. But they did not do that.
People were shocked, I think, at the arrogance of the mining promoters, feeling they could get away with anything and there would be no recourse. People were quite outraged with the behavior of the McMillans and their cohorts, who were also cashing in.
So every bad thing that had ever happened on the Toronto Stock Exchange since World War II were blamed on Viola. And she became the focal point and the reason. And when the brokerage houses all started to complain because they were losing all this business, it's Viola's fault. She became a victim.
But Viola, never comfortable in the role of victim, continued to barter backroom deals. Before the Windfall fraud charges went to trial, and at the lowest point in her life, Viola was engineering her own and George's complete rehabilitation.
Mrs. Viola McMillan has been convicted on a charge of wash trading in shares of Consolidated Golden Arrow Mines Limited. She will be sentenced next Wednesday. York County Court Judge Garth Moore, in returning his judgment today, said there was little doubt she had created an impression of activity in Golden Arrow when she ordered the transactions through the stock exchange.
For 3 long years, angry investors anticipated Viola's and George's long fraud sentence for the Windfall scam. But before the Windfall fraud could come to trial, Viola alone was charged, not with fraud, but with wash trading, the manipulating of shares in Windfall Mines by Golden Arrow, another company she owned.
Wash trading is a really popular device to manipulate the price of a stock. What a promoter will do is buy shares, one account, buy, move the price up. Once the price comes up, then start selling and recoup some investment. Buy and sell. It creates the illusion of activity in the marketplace. If stock is moving, seems to be popular, there's activity, it attracts people.
The joke of that is that wash trading was so common that people didn't even consider it a crime. It was just something that everybody did. How else does a junior get its stock up? You know, like how often you find something really rich, really good, they'll take a stock up. So it was a common practice. The Toronto Stock Exchange knew about it. The Securities Commission knew about it, but it was against the law.
Viola was still looking out for the man and the mining community she loved. She never pointed fingers at George, and she never badmouthed mining practices. Instead, she continued to set records. She was the first person ever imprisoned for wash trading, and in her 60s, the oldest woman in Ontario ever sent to reformatory. Always conscious of an entrance and of the media, Viola was taken to a Brampton, Ontario penal unit wearing a fur coat, driving in the back of a black Cadillac. Her sentence for wash trading could have been 5 years. She got 9 months, and she was out in 7 weeks. The public and the politicians were enraged.
You have to remember that people read every day about a woman who stole a bar of soap or maybe a pair of nylons or a pound of sausages for her children, getting sent to prison for 6 months and serving every day of that 6 months. Here is a woman who was guilty of a crime, I think, that involved some $1,700,000. I'm not quite certain, but I know the figure is high enough that just thinking about it makes me pass out from lack of oxygen. And here she gets out in less than 2 months.
When a judge gives anyone an indeterminate sentence, he is in fact saying to the Ontario Parole Board, we leave it entirely up to you how long a sentence this person should serve in the institution. But it shall be, for instance, in Mrs. McMillan's case, no longer than 9 months. But you may allow her out any time before that under your supervision.
Friends and enemies alike were convinced that Viola had used her high-level political and business contacts to concoct a deal in the copper-topped confines of government. Take the small hit for the trumped-up wash trading charges, and the much more serious windfall fraud charges might suddenly disappear.
I think a deal was made that instead of dragging out a big long trial on Windfall, that they'd forget about Windfall, and she would plead guilty to a fairly insignificant thing on Golden Arrow, which she did, and she'd get a fairly light sentence.
I don't know that that happened, but I suspect that I would surmise that it did. That's how these things are, which have a political dimension, are frequently resolved.
I think there was a certain degree of satisfaction that justice had been played out. She deserved to go to jail, whether it's for 9 months or whether she gets off in 6 months or whether she'd gone for 2 years. The fact is, she got a jail term, and she did wrong. She paid the price.
On prison paper, in handwriting reminiscent of a long-ago secretarial school, Viola wrote to George on the evening of January 11th, 1968.
After this very unpleasant experience, I'm sure our lives will be richer and fuller. I'm sure there will be still time left in our lives for us to do some good and be a friend to man. I pray that whatever wrong error I have committed, that many others will benefit, now and in the years to come. I'm sorry for you, darling, after nearly 44 years of happily married life, that this tragedy should happen. All my love, Viola.
Viola would later say that the hardest part of serving time was being away from George. They were inseparable from the moment they met. Though they fell in love with mining, they never stopped being in love with each other. Maybe they thought that Windfall would pay off after all. Maybe they delayed publicizing the first core sample results in the hope that the second samples would strike pay dirt. Maybe they'd taken common law-breaking practices for granted. Maybe. After the fine mining dust settled on a collapsed Windfall, George was nowhere to be seen, and Viola was in jail. Reputation in tatters.
Viola McMillan was a pioneer of deception only insofar in that she got caught. There were other people doing what she was doing. She wasn't making all of this stuff up. She wasn't improvising. There were plenty of models that she could follow.
Well, she had money before and she had money after. What she lost was respect. She lost her position. She had to resign as president of the Prospectors and Developers. And she lost the respect of the Toronto crowd. She didn't lose the respect of the mining people. She moved very easily in mining circles till her death.
Strangely, there was never any talk of George taking a rap. Viola was the lone target. In 1969, George and Viola were acquitted of all charges related to fraud in Windfall. They now lived a quiet life, engaged primarily in philanthropy. In 1978, after 52 years of marriage, Viola lost George. 3 months after his death, Viola was handed a full, unconditional pardon on the wash trading conviction. This canonization continued for the rest of Viola McMillan's life. In 1993, she was given the Order of Canada for her work in the mining industry. 3 months after her exceptional exoneration, Viola, the ultimate dealmaker, the scapegoat, the manipulator, and the pioneer, died, leaving behind her double-edged legacy. In their own minds, white-collar criminals are never guilty. After all, no guns are waved, no blood is spilled. Just a lot of anonymous people losing their life savings. From Windfall to Bre-X and beyond, stock market manipulators will perpetually plead innocence as they leave with the loot.